Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's bootcamp. Good to see you, Miriam.
Good to see you too, Laura.
How are you today?
I'm very well. How are you?
Doing pretty good. So I'm excited about this topic. We got lots to say.
We got lots to say. I'm excited too. If people are jumping in, you can put in the chat where you're from. We'd always love to hear where people are in the world.
Definitely tell us why you're here, what you're hoping to get out of the session. And on the right, you'll also see the Q&A. When we're in the session, you can ask us questions and hopefully we'll answer live. So I think we'll give it a few moments for people to join. Lots of lovely places today.
Yeah. Panama, Zurich, New York. I love it.
A few from the UK. Hopefully it's sunny where you are too.
And I saw some people from Canada. Yeah. Ontario. I'm sitting in Toronto and Laura's in the UK.
I am. I am in Liverpool today. Welcome, everybody.
And just to, as you're jumping on, just to repeat what Laura said, if you want to share what you want to or what you're hoping to get out of the session, feel free to put that into the chat as well. Any expectations?
Sorry about the England-Spain match. Yes, I know. We are very sorry too. Well, the weather here, Lucas, thank you for asking. We love to talk about the weather in the UK. It's actually pretty sunny and pretty warm, so I'm happy.
It's actually nice and sunny here too. People always think it's always cold in Canada, and that's not true. We have a really hot summer so far.
It's always raining in England. I'm hoping for no more rain this year because I think we've had a year's worth already. All right, I think we'll give it another minute for people to join and register. We
Looking
have
for a
David
little
joining, looking
wisdom.
for... I love that. Hopefully you'll leave with some. All right, I think we should get going, Miriam. So let me share my screen. Give me one moment and we'll kick off the session. Thank you, everybody, for joining today's bootcamp. The topic for today is on driving strategy through effective change management. My name is Laura Blackmore, Head of Strategy Execution at Cascade. Hopefully, if you've been to these events before, we will have definitely met each other. Miriam, do you want to say a quick hello?
Yeah, of course. My name is Miriam Lesa, and I'm Strategy Execution Director here at Cascade. And yeah, you will also have seen me before if you joined those events previously. So let's jump right in, and hopefully we can share some wisdom today. So to kick off this session, we want to share a big statistic and a big number. We've actually conducted this in one of our researches, and we found that 90% of the strategies actually fail, and the majority of them actually during execution. So we want to unpack that a little bit more. Why do they fail, and why do they fail, especially during execution? So what we've seen is oftentimes companies and organizations, they have this solid strategy, everything is built out, the team stands behind it, there is a carefully laid out plan, they have the buy-in from key stakeholders, and leadership team feels really strong about execution, probably is already 5 steps ahead and wants to just execute fast. But I mean, it depends on the strategies, but oftentimes strategies have a lot of change, and change is usually part of any strategy. And sometimes the change is a really positive change, but sometimes the change means also there is a change in the ways of working. There's a change in the way things are being approached and things are being managed between teams potentially. There's a different focus that the organization is taking, and things are being disrupted one way or another. And as soon as there is change present, no matter how big or small, it needs to be managed. And what we see is why do they fail is because oftentimes most of the organizations or most of the teams that are responsible to execute the strategy, they miss on this really important part. And I like to call it like they have the left brain part all in place. It's all the factual things. It's all the strategy, the plan, essentially more the project management part. But they miss that right brain side. And what does that mean? It is like wrapping the communication really more around what is going on in the organization, what is the collective emotion, being mindful of the corporate culture. Where are people right now? How do they feel? What's going on for people? Did they go through a lot of change previously? People are very sensitive to all of these things. So it's ultimately really finding that balance between not only the what and the why, but also the how, and then finding the balance and rolling that out in a in a way that is capturing all of that to ultimately have an effective strategy, but also bring all the people on board. And we'll unpack a lot of this today. So, not only the left brain, also the right brain. And that's why change management is so important. When project management is more focused on the left brain, change management is really more that right brain side. And that's really focusing on guiding the people side of the change, supporting people through this process, through active listening and through lots of, we're going to go into a lot of details of how to do this and how to do it effectively. Because again, first of all, strategy and strategy execution is hard. Change management is hard. So any tips and tricks that we can share today will hopefully be helpful, and you can hopefully walk away with some of that wisdom that you were looking for.
Definitely. Thanks for opening up, Miriam. I think it's always good to take a bit of a step back and talk a little bit about what we mean by change management. I think it's one of those phrases that often gets kicked around or gets thrown around in an organization. But I think if we take a step back, what is change management? It really is that discipline that focuses on you managing changes within an organization and involves all of those implementation approaches to how you prepare, support your employees through the change, how you take teams through change, and how leaders actually make that change as well. And I think there's a few things that getting change management right can do. I think one of them is minimizing resistance. People are always resistant to change, particularly if it involves how they maybe operate from day to day, or how they're thinking about coming into the workplace. I think minimizing risk, most importantly, as it goes alongside that. I think maintaining productivity, it's probably one of those phrases that we hear most often now, since the boom in remote working, and since the pandemic. Everything is about raising and maintaining productivity, but also how you enhance the communication across the business as well. And then finally, good change management can also help build engagement across teams. Again, especially with working with global organizations and remote companies, that becomes really, really important. So I want to take you through just a few concepts that I really like, and I'll talk through my sort of favorite concept. It'd be really keen to hear from you, either in the Q&A or in the chat, which ones you've tried and tested. But I think there's three that I like to lean on particularly and that I've seen work really well. The first is Lewin's model, the second one is Kotter's 8-step process, and the third one is the ADKAR change model. That one's my favorite, and I'll talk a little bit about why in a moment. But Lewin's model is, really it was founded by Kurt Lewin. He was a psychologist. He was one of the pioneers of kind of social, organizational, and applied psychology in the US. During his career, he used or applied himself really to three main topics: applied research, action research, and group communication. He's often recognized as the founder of social psychology, and he was one of the first to study kind of group dynamics and organizational development quite a little while ago. And I think his model represents three main stages. You've got the unfreeze, you've got the change, and then you've got the freeze again. So unfreezing is really where you prepare your organization for change, you create awareness about the need for change, you overcome resistance. It really involves breaking down those existing mindsets, the attitudes, and the behaviors that actually cause people to be resistant to change. And that can be achieved through good communication, through education as well, and getting people involved, or key stakeholders certainly involved in the process. The second phase is where the actual change is implemented, where you may have new processes, systems, structures, or even new behaviors and values that you want to instill in your team members. And this is where employees actually begin to adopt the new ways of working. It might involve, or if you've seen this in the past, particularly if you've skipped the first kind of unfreeze phase and gone straight into the second, this is where you'll be training people, providing support, addressing challenges, but they may not really have that awareness yet of what's important. So it's really nice to have that kind of three-stage process. Then the final one is really once you've implemented the change, how do you stabilize the new state? How do you reinforce the changes? How do you ensure that they actually become ingrained in the culture? The refreezing element actually involves establishing those new norms, those practices and systems that actually help you to support the desired change and prevent regression to the old ways of doing things as well. The second model, personally, I find a little bit too complex and it's definitely not my favorite, but I thought it was interesting to bring another perspective. And that is the Kotter's 8-step change model. John Kotter was quite well known as kind of a speaker on the topic of leadership and change. He had a lot of experience and knowledge in change and leadership that has been proven time and time again. And his 8 steps actually involve, it's kind of 3 parts, but broken into 8 steps. You've got the first element, which is kind of creating that climate for change, where you want to create urgency, form a coalition, create that vision for change. So it's a little bit more visionary, those initial steps. After that, you want to sort of engage and enable your organization. So, thinking about that second stage in the earlier model, this is where you're communicating the vision, you're empowering action, maybe also creating quick wins. So, I quite like that about the model is getting those wins quite early. And then the last part is really that implementation and sustaining the change. And that's where you build on it and you make it stick. So it's very, very similar to the other model. My favorite is actually the ADKAR methods. And the reason why is because it's very simple. ADKAR stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. So it's quite easy to remember. This one was developed a couple of decades ago by Jeff Hyatt after studying change patterns at more than 700 organizations. And I really like it because it's quite practical. It's less theoretical than the other models for me personally. And I think it's quite easy to implement quickly. So if we think about the first stage being awareness, before you have your people consider changes, they must be aware of the need to change. But that's not enough by itself. So individuals won't change unless they want to. So then you have to create that desire for change. And that's where you might involve communication and really rally the people around, bringing in part of that kind of powerful coalition that was mentioned in another model a moment ago. But then to change individuals effectively, they also need to know how to change as well. So increasing that knowledge, increasing again the communication. We talk a lot about communication in our events and our podcasts because it's really important, and I don't think you can over communicate. But really, people want to know the goal and the stages that follow. Then I think once people know how to change, they can start to then develop that ability to do things in new ways, helping them increase their ability, giving them permission to fail, being patient, giving quick wins, and celebrating success. And then I think really that comes that sort of knowledge and ability. So we've created awareness, we've created the desire, we've given people the knowledge, they now have the ability. Next is really that reinforcement step. So change will only really be lasting if people can use the new ways of working that they've learned and help them embed new ways of doing things. It becomes a habit rather. You can be positive around how you want to reinforce them. And in other words, I guess what I'm saying is those good behaviors can be celebrated, they can be rewarded, and bad habits can be challenged. But I think, how does this translate back to strategy execution? I think one of the things that we always talk about is for successful strategy execution, we need good change management as well. And I think the one concept we talk about most often here at Cascade is the key to that successful execution is good synchronization, good connection between your teams, between the culture and the strategy, between change and the strategy. So strategy development and execution by nature is an exercise in change, whether that's the corporate strategy that you're introducing, whether it's business strategies, whether it's specific projects, or how your teams are cross functionally aligned. All strategies are the choice to do something different than the status quo, and that's what imposes that degree of change. And change really needs to be managed and can also be synchronized with each other. So I think we've talked a little bit about how people are resistant. We've also seen that organizations, as kind of if you think of them as kind of heads of people, can be very resistant to change, even when we know that things are necessary. So I think successfully adopting a new strategy with these change initiatives, regardless of how radical or even small incremental changes you're making, can be difficult and can be messy. And I think, the consequence of that poorly managed transformation can be quite detrimental to the business. Miriam, I would love you to tell us a little bit more about what successful change management means to you and what that means for the business.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I love how you explained the different models. And also, I'm aligned with you. This is also, ADKAR is also my favorite model. So, but looking a little bit more into what successful change management really needs. And we touched on it already earlier, and even just in the models that Laura just explained, they all have something in common because they all have this first phase of that awareness, or whatever you want to call it, to really bring the people on board and create that desire. So, as we said earlier, there is the what and what you want to change, but then it's also about how do you actually do this. So if we click one more, so you'll see the what is obviously is your strategy, whatever that strategy is. And again, it can be growth, expansion, portfolio diversification, or sometimes it's even maybe an organizational change project that is attached to the strategy. And that obviously requires a lot more change for the organization and is a lot bigger. It's a lot more impact. Whatever it is that part of the change in your strategy, it needs to be connected to the how. Because ultimately, if you can't change your people, you really can't change anything. And I believe most of you have probably heard the famous quote from Peter Drucker before: culture eats strategy for breakfast. So this is always a good reminder for us of how important it is to bring both of them together. So the how is really talking about the desired culture here. It's like, how do we enable the people? How do we align them? How do we connect them? The synchronization element that Laura talked about is so critical here. And how do we enable the leaders to really be part of the change and also communicate in the right way with their people, listen to them, understand where resistance potentially comes from? So all in all, if we look at all of this, again, strategy is part of like we making those improvements of operations. That's obviously the original goal. That's where we go out there. But really, like it's coming down to that how to set up for sustained success. Because ultimately, you can change something fairly quickly, and but if people are not bought in, it's not going to be a long-term change. It's not really going to be sustainable, and that's really what you would look for with your strategy or any projects related to your strategy where you want to create that sustained success in your organization. And then I believe I hand back over to you, Laura, to talk a little bit more about how to implement the change successfully.
Definitely. I
Or
would
this
love
still
to hear as well from the audience if you have implemented or not implemented change successfully, and what that really meant for you. But I think in this next section, we want to talk a little bit about how we manage resistance, how we overcome obstacles. And I think some of the biggest causes of that managing resistance, as we mentioned a moment ago, or how we can sort of overcome the obstacles of people when you're trying to implement this change, is one, it can often be mistrust, particularly if you have people who've been around for a little while and change maybe hasn't gone that successfully in the past. I've definitely seen examples of maybe technology changes where there's been a bit of a failure in the past, and people don't want to go through that experience again. We talked about communication a lot. Lack of communication, again, is something I hear time and time again, particularly in a remote world where there's less opportunities to do that. I think fear of failure and sort of like that lack of emotional understanding from teams. Everybody has a fear of failure, no matter what they say. So that's definitely one of the pieces around resistance. But Miriam, what are your thoughts? What else have you seen in terms of causes of managing resistance in your personal experience?
Yeah, I've definitely seen, like, even just managing through a couple of really big change projects myself. People do go through that famous change curve, and there is some sort of anger to begin with, and the resistance, and then they bargain potentially, and then there is maybe that depression phase until they actually truly accept and come out of it. And every person moves through this whole change curve on a different pace as well. Every team moves through it on a different pace. So it's really about being mindful as well about the time that people need moving through the change. But at the same time, I also see sometimes I've seen projects being managed on a bit of a too long of a time frame. That can also be really difficult because then you lose the momentum. So it's a really fine line between being like in this momentum of managing the change, not going too fast, but also not going too slow, because you might actually like get people on board. And if you're then going a bit too slow, it can like break it again. So I find like finding that really fine balance is very critical. And maybe if we talk about some of the techniques, how to do that, that's really where I find the value is to listen to the team. And I think active listening is really the most critical part here that you can do as a leader or as a team lead, or if you're managing change more from a strategy team. Either way, having one-on-ones or having check-ins actively to really understand where people are at and how they're feeling is super, super valuable to ultimately like get this knowledge from the organization and manage through this. Of course, as a good technique is you want to show every employee and the team what's in it for them. They need to understand not only the bigger why, they also need to understand what's in it for them. How is this change doing things better for them? And sometimes it doesn't, right? So it's really hard. So we need to find that fine balance here to manage people through it. Ideally, always connected back to the bigger strategy, to the bigger goals as well, and reiterate why this is better for the organization as a whole in the longer term. Again, I already talked a little bit about the collect employees' input prior to change as well. Even I think oftentimes the change is being decided, and I've seen that as well, and then it's like being tried to being implemented in this really, really fast way. But bringing in the right employees, and maybe even those employees that are maybe a little bit more resistant to change or are the ones that have bigger influence in the organization, can be very valuable to ensure that all the voices are captured and you're managing through the change most effectively. So, and then of course, including also the right tools and the right like knowledge share, all of these elements that are part as well of those change models, that's very important. And again, Laura mentioned it earlier, communicate frequently and also be honest. I'm saying that it's such a given, but at the end of the day, sometimes there is no progress in this change process or in the strategy creation or whatever it is. And that's okay. It's fine to also communicate with teams that it's being worked on and this is what it is right now, and just communicate a process update. I find oftentimes, I've seen it myself so many times, leaders holding back to communicate because, oh, there is no update really. That doesn't matter. Like teams just want to hear from you. They just want to know what's going on. And that makes them feel better in many ways. And that's really all of what you need in this when you're managing the people through, especially a change process. So yeah, and then I think one last element that I wanted to add that's not on the slide here either, but it is really that element of adding in those quick wins and showing why the change is good in on different levels. And that can be, again, like it can be through celebration of some of the team members or a quick success that has been achieved. But any of those quick wins is just helping to get out of that change curve a little bit faster, but also like in a good and in the right way.
I think there's some
So those are
incredible
some.
comments in the chat as
Oh,
well.
okay,
Sorry,
amazing.
Miriam. Yeah, there's some great comments in the chat around having leadership visible on the journey. I think you touched on that actually anyway, of,
I love
you
that.
know, even
Yeah.
if there's not an update, having that the leadership team visible, but also the other causes of sort of resistance to change, like cultural resistance or bad timing. Yeah, that's definitely something I've seen before. Fear of increased workload. I think everybody's felt that at some point, or probably currently in their roles right now. Or even, yeah, I think there's a great comment here around the change is perceived to threaten employees, and I think one of my favorite ways to overcome this is sort of showing people what's in it for them, but helping them to see how great this is for them. And it's definitely not an overnight thing, but everybody wants to know what's in it for me. So I think that there's some really interesting comments coming through on that. Think in terms of sort of how you build a change ready culture. I think there's a few questions or comments on this, but I think it's it's definitely an organizational environment that you want to embrace and actively prepare for change. And I think me and Miriam talk about quite a lot how businesses need to live and breathe their values, their behaviors, enable individuals and teams to be able to live and breathe those values and hold people accountable. But I think in a change ready culture, change shouldn't be viewed as a disruption or a threat, but rather an opportunity for growth, agility and innovation, continually improving and continually having that mindset that we always want to get better. And I think there's four core elements that we would really note as being the four elements to building a change ready culture that hopefully you can take with you and start to implement in your organizations. I think the first one is employees feeling empowered and being able to take ownership. You want your employees to strive under that growth mindset. You want to embrace new ideas. You don't want to almost ostracize anybody who's failing. Of course, we should always discipline people, but I think actually getting people to feel empowered and bring ideas can be really, really innovative. I think strong leadership, strong leaders who communicate. I think we've talked about a number of times, but you want leaders to be able to model those desired behaviors and values, and they're open and transparent with how they communicate in the business. But equally, they are supporting and valuing their employees too, can go a really long way. I think then having almost that teams work cross functionally or cross departmentally to drive that change. We often talk at Cascade about the ability to create change agents. I think you've called them before, Miriam. I like to see them as like champions, but people that you can almost, I think we were talking about it yesterday and we used the word infiltrate your team members who can like infiltrate the business but in a very positive fashion, and almost leveraging collective strengths and resources to be able to drive that change together. Change will definitely not come from one or two people. And I think having a strong purpose and goals that anchor the organization, not being able to, or not being afraid to repeat the purpose, repeat the vision, repeat the goals at every opportunity, but equally celebrating and driving momentum of progress to be made. I don't know if you've got anything else to add there, Miriam, before you talk about leadership and change.
Nothing really to add here. I think the only thing that kind of stands out is like, I guess us with all the elements that Laura just mentioned, maybe together with what I'm talking about here, it's about setting up a culture that is change ready almost, and that is more open to change, that has that mindset that change is a positive thing. And that takes work, right? Like none of what we're talking about here, and I see comments like many of you went through all of this or go through all of this right now as well. It's not easy and it's not fast. It takes time. Change takes time, and managing through change is hard and also takes a lot of time. So, what can the leadership or can leaders do to help make it easier, but also to maybe develop some of those change agents or champions or whatever you want to call it in your organization? You might have your own names already, but having those champions, change agents in the organization is, in my opinion, very, very critical and very important, because they can really be the ones who are maybe on those levels with other team members where they can provide information back to the leader as well of what's really going on in the organization, how people feel. And that is always a good kind of channel for any leader to have, to understand a little bit more of the pulse of the organization. And it helps to act upon it, because oftentimes, especially maybe as a CEO or a general manager or whatever, in a higher position leader you are, you're probably a little bit further removed from some of the people that are ultimately the ones who need to execute on the change and also drive the change. So understanding what's going on in the organization, then engaging people on the right level, and of course, like inspire that confidence as well in your team members, conveying the trust. All of that really happens, coming back to what we said earlier, through frequent communication. I also saw something in the chat that I just want to pick up on as well. Which I think is also an amazing tool to do, is like doing either like change readiness assessments or surveys, just to check in with your team and understand what do they actually stand, and what's going on right now, especially when we're like facing change fatigue and a lot is happening in an organization and we are ready to get out and roll out a big strategy. We need to have the team ready and really have them on board. So you don't want to risk that your team is at a point of change fatigue when you're like getting ready to roll out your new amazing strategy. And a lot of the other elements we already talked about as well, but empathizing with your teams. I also saw a great comment in the chat. It's like speaking the language of your teams and of your people. It's so important to connect and to really like make the people feel heard and seen. So we have I think we have some really practical examples how you can ultimately really come into action as well. Change in general, I find it's similar to just like leadership in general. It's I think it's very easy to talk about in many ways, and people know in theory what's supposed to happen, because it's probably also human nature in many ways, or just logical. But then actually doing it is really, really hard, because it requires a certain skill set that needs to be trained and practiced all over again. So we put together a couple of practical tools that hopefully help you to manage through the change a little bit easier, and specifically change related to your strategy execution. Again, we're not reinventing any tools that Kotter and Co are putting out there, but this might help you to manage specifically the change when it comes to strategy execution.
Yeah, I was going to say we're a strategy execution platform, so of course we're talking about strategy and not just change. But I think we like to think about strategy being three core phases. I think there's sort of the creation, which can sometimes be maybe mixed in with kind of the pre-planning phase, and this is where you're making that strategic choice about the direction of the company. It may include market analysis, maybe setting big long-term aspirational goals. Then you've got kind of the more traditional planning side, where you might create that actionable roadmap for your strategy. Might include things like setting your initiatives and your KPIs, as well as your risk and mitigation plans. And then finally is the strategy execution phase, which, depending on which organization you're at, sometimes gets forgotten rather, or doesn't exist at all. And this is really where your strategy is coming to life. You're using what you learn in the pre-planning or the sort of creation side. You're using what you've used in the planning side, and you're really getting into the reporting and the tracking and those operating cadence around your strategy. I think, Miriam, I'd love for us to talk, probably coming up towards the end here, but how we can actually measure change along this process. I think I'll probably just call out a couple here and then pass it over to you. But I think some ways that you can really manage the change is, particularly at the creation process, you want to include and involve key stakeholders early. You want to be able to know that you're sharing those findings, you're updating regularly. I think somebody did mention in the chat earlier how you kind of identify maybe the kind of naysayers or the change seekers, or identifying people who maybe aren't on board with the change, and definitely you want to go after those people as well and bring them on the journey as part of that. But Miriam, what would you say in terms of planning and execution? What would be your favorite ways to measure that change?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And I really like this little checklist here, because it helps to make something maybe a little bit intangible, a little bit more tangible here. But yeah, just to point out a few here, again, like including subject matter experts into the planning process. Again, the more we include people in it, the better. And here, I think it was like, how do you identify also the naysayers? Just to talk about that for a second as well. I think the closer you are to your organization, or you have the right people who can share with you honestly who the naysayers are, that will obviously make it a lot easier. And it's probably actually a good thing to include some of the naysayers in the process earlier, in my opinion, because they can be a critical voice. And it's good to have those different perspectives as you're looking at a really big change project like strategy execution. My former CEO always did roundtables every month, and he just did like a coffee chat, and he invited, it was like first come, first serve. I think I mentioned that on another bootcamp previously. First come, first serve, whoever wanted to join. It was like a limited number, 10 people. Just come sign up, and it was an hour of no agenda, just freely talking about what's going on. So that's a good way if you're looking to identify maybe some naysayers and yes sayers as well. But coming back to this checklist as well, again, I think every single point here is very important. I'm just going to call out maybe one more here as well, maybe the third one. Sharing updates again with employees throughout the process. I feel like I cannot reiterate that often enough, because I've seen it both ways, and I've just seen the power of reiterating in a positive way what the process is. That's probably one of my key learnings of any rollout or any change process. And just to touch on a couple on the strategy execution side, again, all of them are important. But I just want to touch on here on this element again around feedback and celebration, and really bringing in those regular little wins along the journey, and celebrating them as well, and celebrating them publicly as well. That's really effective. It just makes people feel good as well, and they see how they contribute to the bigger picture. Anything
Thanks,
else you
Mary.
want to add, Laura?
No, I think that's good. I think, yeah, there's a lot here, and I think a few people are asking for the slides, so I think you can download them. I think there's a note on how to get them, so feel free to use them. I think in our final few minutes before we go to Q&A, and we'd love to invite some of you to ask some questions. Miriam, do you want to introduce our final speaker?
Yes, for sure. We have the pleasure to have Beckley joining us, and give a really brief overview about what Cascade is actually all about. And we're excited for you to hear a little bit more about that, and we'll stay on after that for the Q&A.
Thank
Hello,
you.
let
Welcome back.
me go ahead and pull up my screen. Thank you all for the introduction. I will get this up, and I would love to share with you all a little something. So, as Miriam said, my name is Beck. I'm here to introduce to you a little way that you can transform the way that you do strategy. So, the chances are that you are here on this session because your strategy hasn't been progressing how you want it to. You just can't seem to hit those targets or complete the strategic initiatives that you're setting out to. And while change management is obviously a huge part of that, there is another aspect that I want to touch on. So I'll make a wild guess. If you're here today, your strategy probably lives in one of these two handy little tools. You know how the feeling goes with these. The spreadsheets are overflowing, the slides are scattered everywhere, tabs are multiplying faster, you could even click on them. But you would not be the first ones to struggle with this. Lucky for you, you have just stumbled upon the only solution that you will ever need for your strategy situation. Cascade centralizes your strategy under one single roof, enabling accelerated decision making and streamlined efficiency so you know exactly what's going on with your strategy. Picture this: no more slow decision making, no more working in silos, no more wasted time. Cascade helps you execute your strategy faster than ever by enabling your team to plan, execute, and track everything in one single easy to use platform. Here's how Cascade will change the way you approach strategy for good. First, it will accelerate your decision making by centralizing your tech stack under one single roof. You'll see all of your key metrics and present them on sleek reports created in just a few clicks. No more time wasted getting those end of the month figures together. Cascade makes your reports for you with no need to update them. Just choose what you want to report on and easily share it with whoever needs to see it. Next, you'll be breaking down those silos and making visibility the word of the year. We all know that teams operating in silos duplicate work, often put time into projects that are not aligned with your organization's strategy. Cascade changes that with a state of the art planner. You can see what everyone is working on and how that is impacting your overarching strategy. Finally, you'll be aligning your teams like never before and making them focus on what really matters. With Cascade's alignment map, you can see what initiatives are aligned across the organization, give your projects purpose, and discard those that don't have an effective impact on your ultimate goals. If you are ready to transform your strategy forever, go ahead and book a quick call with us, and you'll see how Cascade will transform your current strategy situation into an efficiency and execution machine. And the best part is that some of our customers like Mercedes, Carhartt, and Bosch said that Cascade has improved their bottom line in less than 12 months. So go ahead and book that call and bring transparency, alignment, and fast decision making to your team today. You should see a button on your screen to go ahead and book that call. We would love to speak to you soon. And I will hand it back over to Laura and Miriam for the last few minutes here to answer some questions. Feel free to ask anything about the session or about Cascade, and we would love to share with you.
Thank you, Beck. All right, I think it's Q&A time. I think there's a couple of questions, but feel free to pop them in or use the chat if you want. We're happy to answer your questions directly. I think there's a great question here, Miriam. I'm not sure if you've read it yet. Going through change right now, having conversations on the importance of culture and what culture change means. Is it changes in behavior or a full operational change, including reward and performance management? Interested in hearing other people's thoughts. I know we actually discussed yesterday on our new podcast series that is launching soon about sort of performance management, reward, and how that's linked to culture. But what recommendations would you give?
Yeah, I think this is a fabulous question. I think in this case, I would actually really say culture change means both. And I think it starts in many ways with the behavior change, but behavior change can sometimes come through a new reward system or performance management system, especially. I mean, we always like to say as well, ideally, this is somehow connected to your strategy. So it's all aligned and synchronized, as we said earlier, to really help to change behavior and change the culture overall. I think culture change is connected quite a bit. And we talked about that in our podcast yesterday quite a bit. It is very much connected to the values as well that you want your organization to embody. So I'd always say start with the values, and they can then either they can also be part of the performance management system or reward system, whatever you call it. Actually think this is a very powerful way to help people embody the right values as well. And it will be because again, we need the left brain and the right brain. So you need a little bit of this a toolbox as well to help reward people, but you also need to help them see effectively like what is it that they're like doing with all of that, and how do they live it ultimately. Anything you'd
I
like
like
to
that.
add, Laura?
No, I think that makes sense. I'm seeing the little banner that's coming
Oh,
up. Yes, we did drop in a little hint to the podcast. Maybe I shouldn't have, but it is coming very, very soon. No, I think that makes sense. I think maybe from my sort of personal experience, and maybe one of the other comments that came through around the reward and recognition, probably specifically. I think I've worked in organizations where reward and performance was really linked to strategy. And then I've been in other organizations rather where they had a great culture and a great rewards program, but strategy was very separate. And I think you have to figure out what is the right combination for your organization. I think there was a comment here around people don't find value in showing up to work anymore, but expect to be rewarded. And I've definitely seen that as well. But I think it's not just about the financial reward. There are other ways that people want to be rewarded. They want to see their leadership, representation. They want to see communication. They want, other ways to maybe spend time with their family that isn't just like the financial reward. And I think you just have to figure out what is um, the right flow for your organization, like the industry that you work in, how competitive it is, the values that you want to represent, obviously the existing culture, the existing employees, the size. There's quite a lot that need to go into it. There was a great question around, well, not a great question because we didn't cover the topic, but I think we spent a lot of time on change management rather than strategy development methods. I'd be really curious, the person who asked this, whether you are looking for more assistance with sort of how to develop strategies, like where to start. Is it frameworks? Like how do you actually go on that sort of creation approach? We've definitely covered more of that in previous sessions, which you can definitely watch the recording on. And then again, the podcast is all about strategy, creation, execution, culture, everything. So I think we'll probably cover it there. But do you have any thoughts on that, Miriam?
the strategy development question particularly, yeah, I mean, we I think we did some previous boot camps where we talked a little bit more about the strategy execution part specifically, and the deployment of strategy. We haven't touched so much about this on the strategy creation and the development just yet, but be sure that it will come if latest in the podcast. So definitely stay tuned for that, because it's a whole other topic. But I want to touch on a couple other things that I see here in the questions as well. That value question around how people people find no longer value when they come to work. I find oftentimes there is a this thinking as well of like, oh, really big things need to happen in order to like show employees the value of this and that. And sometimes it's true, but oftentimes it's not actually the big things. Like I feel like I've lived through a lot of different teams and organizations and seen different leadership styles as well. And ultimately, it really comes down to the small things that happen every day and how appreciation is shown to employees. So I feel like everybody can do that for themselves and can start there to show that appreciation to employees. I find in general today we're living a little bit more in a culture, and I think that's maybe also a bit steered by social media, where everybody's definitely looking for purpose and in their lives and look for purpose in their jobs. And organizations need to deliver on this purpose for their employees to a certain degree. And let's be honest, that's not always going to happen. And there is also a different way of finding purpose that's not only connected to the job, but there needs to be fun and there needs to be a level of appreciation, obviously. So maybe that's the easier way to start with without diving too deep into this topic. But yeah, let's touch on a couple other questions because I think there are a couple more that came in here.
Yeah, there's one that
Did
came
you
in.
have a chance to scan? Yeah.
Yeah, I had a quick scan through. So during the change process, the leaders need to model the values and behaviors. My personal opinion is that leadership need to model the right values and behaviors for your organization all the time,
All the time.
not just particularly through the change process, which is easier said than done. And obviously, the bigger your organization there is, the more leaders and the more levels that you have. But my personal yeah, maybe this is just from personal experience of working at some organizations where people can get away with a lot of things. I think you should always hold people accountable for the values that you have set for your organization, which is why you shouldn't have too many so that everybody can remember them and they should really work for your organization. Do you agree, disagree, Miriam?
Oh, I 100% agree. There is another really good question here. What I've seen sometimes at the strategic execution stage, I encounter leadership looking to make changes with the strategic creation stage, which we had already passed. So the conversation can end up becoming circular or unaligned. I think this is a really good question. And I definitely see that quite a bit with organizations. As they're moving in the execution phase, they're going back and question everything around the strategy creation phase. And I mean, I think that's where it comes to that's where leadership has to come in. There has to be the line in the sand, I like to call it, where the strategy creation phase is, or I don't know, I'm showing a big thumbs up here, where the strategy creation phase is coming to a certain end, right? And there is a revisiting of the strategy creation phase. But if you're continuously revisiting it throughout the execution process, can be like, again, like it's a fine line because you want to go in and update and you want to stay agile, but you don't want to change the essence of your strategy either, because I've seen it too many times when it's like, oh yeah, this is the plan, this is the strategy. Oh, a quarter in, it's not working. Let's change it again.
Scrap
You
the
don't
whole thing.
see exactly scrap the whole thing. You don't really see the effects after a short period of time. So you have to give it some time, but continuously obviously check in, monitor. I would say if it becomes a circular or unaligned conversation, maybe the strategy creation or the strategy that has been created isn't strong enough that it's fully aligned and that people don't fully believe in it. So it might be worthwhile in that next phase, whether it's a year later when you update the strategy, to really revisit it and make it stronger. Would you add
Yeah, I
anything
think
to that? Yeah.
No, I completely agree. Actually, I was thinking, again, we were talking about it in one of our podcast episodes around the essence of the strategy, like the framework that you adopt. So at the top, you want that long-term vision, you want your focus areas to be really well thought out, and they really shouldn't change, like even 1 to 2 years, maybe even longer, depending on how quickly the organization moves. But and then your objectives, maybe you'll tweak them slightly, but again, they need to be really strong and need to be really well thought out. Beyond that, you can be as agile as you want because we're always going to have our main objectives to strive for. And maybe, yeah, the project you initiated in Q1 just didn't work. It was a huge flop. And in Q2, you want to completely change that project. And that is absolutely fine. But I think if you're changing and scrapping the whole thing, that's where you really want to get cohesive as a leadership team, as a business, of saying, this is our long term vision for 5 to 10 years. These are our focus areas for 1 to 2 years. These are our objectives for the next year. Beyond that, we can chop and change and be agile, but not forgetting that your employees have to come on that journey with you. And if they're coming on that journey and it's constantly changing, they won't know what they need to do when they come in day to day. And that can be incredibly frustrating. And you're not seeing the results either. So that's the only thing that I would add. There was one final question that I would love to talk to you about because it was in the comments rather than the Q&A. Are you able to expand on how governance can influence both strategy and change management? I think we talk about governance quite often, and I think we've talked about a little bit here. But I think for me, governance is it's a big word and it can be a scary word. But I think governance is really that element of how often you're talking about the strategy and what moments you have in the life cycle of your business to talk about strategy, to talk about change, and have the right audience in the room. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. And I think governance is an interesting word, right? Because it sounds sometimes really strict in many ways. But I think the governance part, especially during strategy execution, can be extremely powerful. But it does come down to the right communication and the right conversation and discussion at the right point in time, especially during the execution phase, but also during the strategy building phase. And there was also one question that might actually fit a little bit into that as well, of like, do organizations value diversity of thinking when trying to bring about change or develop a strategy? Groupthink can be a recipe for failure. So it's definitely a good question as well.
Agreed.
Um, I think like there is this saying like if you want to move fast, move alone. If you want to go far, go together, or something like that. I don't get the words fully right, but I would always say diversity of thinking is the way to go, and bringing in those different voices. And yes, it will take longer, but that is probably a good thing if you want to build something that is more sustainable and has more success in the long term. Um, I do agree that sometimes groupthink can be like not going anywhere because you're too democratic, you're not getting anything done. And then I think it requires a strong facilitator to help also maybe if it's too big of a group, it's definitely going to fail. But if a small enough group with the right people on board and you tackle the right things, maybe in some subgroups, can be extremely powerful. And we did this in my past organization where we had to tackle new strategic projects. And my former CEO paired together always like a leader with another leader that was completely different from his business unit. And in the beginning, it wasn't received all that well because it was like, okay, somebody else is going to like talk to my things. But it was extremely powerful because you got that diversity of thought, and it was like helping the long-term success and really helped to move things forward on a more cohesive level. So, yeah, was there anything else? I'm trying to
I think that
see
was
or
most of the questions, and I know we're just coming up on the allocated time here. So I guess some closing thoughts. Yes, we have mentioned the podcast several times. We'll probably get in trouble by the marketing team now because we're going to force them to get that out of planning into production, or however you say it. But that will be out very soon, so look out for that, where we talk about lots of these concepts in short, bite-sized moments. Also, check out the resources on Cascade. Thank you, Beck, for joining us. And if you want to check out Cascade, get a demo, speak to us, you are welcome to do that. And yeah, follow us on LinkedIn. We're always posting some really cool things. We're always doing these kind of events. And of course, we'll put some other resources on there as well. Any last thoughts, Miriam?
No, I thought it was a great session. I always love talking with you about all of this and great questions from the audience. So I love to hear
Great
about
questions.
all this engagement and looking forward to the next one.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of the day, evening, depending on where you are, and we will see you soon. Bye.
Bye bye.